What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about animal companions and mounted combat in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. As we approach the launch of the Enhanced Edition, I've been updating some of my old content, and while I've made videos about this previously, they were from the beta and quite frankly have not aged well. Several things have changed since then, and this is probably the content I've made for Wrath of the Righteous that is most in need of an update. So naturally, I thought we would cover that today. So to kick this off, when it comes to animal companions in particular, there is one wrong choice. Like, period, don't do it. Beyond that, a lot of the animal companions come out in a pretty good place, and we'll talk about some of the specifics here, obviously. But the giant centipede is not something you should ever pick. It is truly the worst. This is for a variety of reasons, but for starters, it cannot be used as a mount, and second, a big part of its attack is a poison spit. However, almost everything in this game is immune to poison, so the giant centipede is well and truly the worst option available to you. Other than that, all of the other animal companions have their ups and their downs. But first, let's talk about how you can get an animal companion. In Wrath of the Righteous, they are plentiful. It is very easy to get them. Now, the simple and straightforward way to get one is simply pick a class that gets an animal companion. Some classes will get it right away at level 1, such as a druid. Other classes can actually get it at like level 4 with a slightly lower pet level. For instance, rangers can get an animal companion at level 4, but the animal companion itself starts at a slightly lower level than your character, which is where the feat Boon Companion can come in. In situations where your animal companion is underleveled, your character can take a feat called Boon Companion that will essentially force your animal companion up to your level. Now, there are other options for obtaining animal companions as well. The other straightforward option is a nature deity. If you're playing a character that gets to choose a deity or like an area of worship, they can pick the animal domain, which will also give them an animal companion, which can be pretty handy for, say, like a cleric or something to then get an animal companion. Another option available to you is the Azada Mythic Path. They, of course, get Ivu, the dragon, which grows in power and can be used as a mount and is incredibly effective at that particular role. There are other mythic paths that give you a sort of companion, but not really one that you can use in like mounted combat, so it's a little bit different. But Azada very much so gives you an animal companion. And a fourth and final option for getting an animal companion is actually an item available at the end of Act 2 during the Siege of Dresden. In a house, you can find a item called the Triceratops statue, which will give you a Triceratops companion to whoever has the statue equipped on their hotbar, which is overall a pretty cool option. But now that we have our animal companion, let's talk about leveling it up and how some of that actually works. So a few quick tips about animal companions in general. At some point, you're likely going to want to get their intelligence up to 3 because this unlocks a lot of extra feats for you and can make your life a lot easier. It's not strictly speaking necessary, but it is very helpful, and putting a single point into an intelligence score when you hit like level 4 with your animal companion can be very useful, because animal companions get what are called innate bonuses. They get bonuses to their stats as they level up to keep them relevant, to account for the fact that they don't get as much customization as your actual characters. So at like level 20, your animal companions like strength and dexterity will be upper 20s at the very minimum, assuming they have no equipment on. So your ability bonus increases as they level up are less important for an actual animal companion, so throwing 1 point into an intelligence score isn't going to hurt you any. The other thing is barding. Animal companions are capable of wearing barding, though they have to have the feats for it. So as animal companions level up every odd level, they get to pick a feat like everyone else, and in general, there are some useful things here. Again, if they have intelligence 3, they can take more advanced feats like teamwork feats, which are very helpful in mounted combat, provided your character also has them. But then there are the actual barding feats, light, medium, and heavy. You have to take them in order. However, an archetype for animal companions can get you the light and medium feats for free, which is a nice way to go if you're looking to just be a little tankier. Then there's the more obvious stuff like giving them weapon focus in the type of attack that they're making, which we'll talk about natural attacks here in a little bit. Obviously a good way to go. And then there are mounted combat feats that I want to mention specifically because your animal companion does not need the mounted combat feats. Your character does? This is a question I see sometimes, so I wanted to make that clear. And from here, let's actually talk about some of the animal companion archetypes, because as your animal companion levels up, you get to choose an archetype for it right at level 1 like everybody else. There are ultimately 7 of them, each with their pros and cons, but starting with Aggressor, this is basically your damage archetype. If you just want as much damage from your animal companion as possible, Aggressor is the way to go. Then there's Bully. Bully gives your animal companion a trip attack. However, due to a recent patch, this is less useful. So trip in general is a good attack to give animal companions, which is why Bully was pretty cool. But recently a patch added a gore attack to several animal companions, and any animal companion that gets a gore attack also gets a free trip attack, which means overall this is less useful because a lot of animal companions just get a free trip attack now. So something to keep in mind. Then there's Bulwark. This will give you the barding feats for free, or at least light and medium, as your animal companion hits certain levels, which can be pretty useful overall. Then there's Daredevil. This gives you dodge bonuses, as well as adding a competence bonus to your mobility, which can be pretty useful actually. This can help your animal companion stay alive a little longer. However, the mobility bonus is to your mount's mobility, and there are several mounted combat feats that can use the rider's mobility to sort of mitigate damage, and Daredevil doesn't actually help with that because Daredevil is giving a mobility bonus to your animal companion and not you, whose mobility check is actually being used for that. But in general, they get a bit more of a dodge bonus to their AC and some extra mobility. Then we have the Death Touched. This is going to allow your animal companion to take negative energy healing, so it kind of makes your animal companion undead, which if you yourself are playing, for instance, a Dampier who has negative energy healing, or you're going Lich, etc., this can be a good option for you. And then we have Racer. This gives a huge speed increase to your animal companion, which can be really, really good actually. So animal companions in general are faster than their riders, meaning that the animal companion's speed is what is used when you're in mounted combat, which is the distance you can travel every turn. Racer makes that even farther by quite a bit, actually. For instance, the Velociraptor can get like 80 feet of movement around, which is intense. And then we have Wrecker, which gives you Sunder Armor and can kind of make enemies a little easier to hit. Now, in general, which archetype you should go with really depends on your build. For instance, there are builds where Death Touched is going to be very helpful for you. There are builds where I prefer Aggressor, and Racer is generally very usable. The only one I would say you genuinely need to watch out for is probably Bully, simply because a lot of animal companions just get that trip attack now, so doubling up on it is very pointless. But all of that brings us to skills. Your animal companions will get skills just like your regular characters will, and naturally there are some that are more important than others. For starters, athletics and mobility are great ways to go. While your animal companion does get access to the full list of skills, it's important to remember that they're not going to be rolling for most of this stuff. You cannot use your animal companion in scripted events, that is to say the text events that pop up sometimes, or conversations. Your animal companions will never be used for those checks. However, they can perform skill checks for you out in the world while you're exploring, which tend to be athletics and mobility. In addition to this, they also have a pretty good feel for perception, so you can give your animal companion perception, though generally speaking you would want this on an actual companion or yourself, so it's not something I would generally relegate to using on an animal companion, though they can be pretty good at it. And then there is also Persuasion. There are several feats that can give your animal companion, or any character with them really, the ability to use Persuasion to cause fear in other enemies. It can be pretty useful, but does require you to actually use the Persuasion, and given animal companions' generally low charisma score, it can be a little difficult to get this number up to where you need it unless you're using a lot of equipment and buffs, etc. But it is worth mentioning that it's possible, especially if you're just playing on normal. And last but not least, a sort of honorable mention. I don't know if they've fixed this, but animal companions used to be able to try to cast from scrolls using Use Magic Device. I would never actually recommend doing this because it's not a useful way to play the game, but as an honorable mention, it makes me laugh, and I don't know if they've fixed it actually, but it was possible to try to get animal companions to cast scrolls with Use Magic Device, though, again, even if this is still working, which I haven't actually checked, there are much better ways to do that, with characters that would actually be successful at doing so. Now, that's pretty much how to think about your companions as you level up. So, when it comes to feats, again, focus on giving them bonuses to their actual natural attacks, their bite, their claw, claws, whatever they've got. If they have 3 intelligence, teamwork feats can be incredibly useful on animal companions. But the main thing to keep in mind there is just what is your animal companion actually using? Because they do get access to a ton of feats that are not going to do them any good because they can't functionally use them. So for a lot of the time with animal companions, it's usually best to go the simple route, like barding, teamwork feats, dodge, that type of stuff, toughness even. Just things that'll make them a tiny bit more survivable. Now, let's talk about animal companions and their attacks, because animal companions use natural attacks, which are quite a bit different from other attacks in the game, and they function differently right out of the gate. So for starters, natural attacks don't get more attacks by having a higher base attack bonus. They just get the amount that they naturally have. However, these attacks are divided up into primary and secondary. Primary natural attacks will be used with the animal companion's full base attack bonus for the attack roll, and then they have secondary natural attacks. These are made with a -5 penalty to their base attack bonus, which is the bonus they get when they roll a d20 to see whether or not they hit something. Now, because they do not get extra attacks as they level up, it's important to understand and know how many attacks your animal companion that you choose gets. Naturally speaking, Velociraptor ends up with the most at, I believe it is 8, but you can easily check all of this when you actually click on your animal companion to see what attacks they get. Though it's important to note, some animal companions will get extra benefits as they level up. For instance, a lot of animal companions grow from medium to large size when they hit level 7, and this will give them a size bonus to their attacks, that type of stuff. Other companions at level 9 can pick up multi-attack, which actually just reduces the penalty on secondary attacks, provided the animal companion has more than 3 to begin with. And secondary attacks in particular, while we're on the subject, only get half of your strength modifier as a bonus, so in general, secondary attacks do a little less damage. But overall, with how natural attacks work, there are some clear benefits and some downsides. On the upside, a lot of animal companions will get a ton of attacks right out of the gate at level 1, which can be pretty strong in the early game, which when combined with various bits of equipment, etc., you can get to a pretty good place with damage and an animal companion. However, that's kind of balanced against their survivability, as melee's always their only option. But that, of course, brings us to Pounce. Pounce is an incredibly strong ability, which is gained at level 7, allows an animal companion to charge and make a full attack at the same time. This is important because with their normal natural attacks, they get all of those attacks if they make a full attack. However, if they move an attack, they only get to make one of their primary attacks. Pounce makes them charge and make a full attack, which is very, very strong. This is why a lot of people like to take the Smilodon or the Velociraptor, because they get Pounce. But now that we've discussed all of that, let's move on to the part of this guide that is how to pick your animal companion. As I mentioned at the start of the video, the only wrong choice is Centipede. Centipede is awful, don't pick it. Every other animal companion has its merits. Now, overall, the top most popular pick, if you want to go that route, is the Smilodon. This is again because of the Pounce and the fact that all of their attacks are primary attacks, meaning that they're all made at the full base attack bonus. This means the Smilodon has the best chance of doing the best damage, which makes Smilodon very, very popular. Velociraptor, while it does also get Pounce, makes a lot of secondary attacks, which means those attacks are made at a penalty. So while it does get more attacks overall, it has a lesser chance of hitting with those attacks. So while Velociraptor can be good and gets an insane amount of movement speed, a lot of people still prefer Smilodon to this. Another thing to keep in mind with animal companions when you're choosing them is the trip attack. So believe it or not, just a regular old dog is considered one of the best animal companions because it gets a free trip attack with its regular bite attack, which will sometimes knock enemies over, which is, in this game, almost guaranteed death. At the very least, it's going to take an enemy out of the fight for a second. Now again, with a recent patch, every animal companion that gets a gore attack also gets a free trip attack, which means the dog's usefulness just made a ton of other animal companions much more viable, such as the boar, the triceratops, the elk even. And the reason this is primarily to counter the fact that animal companions that get gore or bite usually only have that one natural attack. There are items and things that can give an animal companion more natural attacks, but generally speaking, those animal companions only make one attack because it's their only natural attack. And the trip is designed to make them a little more useful as a result. Now, honestly, the dog is the best at it because when it comes to innate bonuses, somehow the dog winds up with the most strength, which gives the dog in particular a higher combat maneuver bonus, which means it's more likely to have a successful trip attack than basically any other animal companion, which might change a little bit because the Triceratops is now getting the trip attacks as well, and it winds up with 32 strength. But because of all those factors, the dog, again, against what would seemingly be common sense, is actually one of the better animal companions to pick. Now, if you don't care about damage at all, and you're just looking for pure survivability, Triceratops is the way to go, as they wind up with the most health and one of the highest natural ACs. But those are pretty much the factors you need to think about when you pick your animal companion. Again, Smilodon, very, very popular. If you're going to pick something else and it has a gore attack, you're going to get a free trip attack. Dog, again, winds up being very useful because it winds up with a very high chance of being able to trip something. But the things to pay attention to here are the natural attacks and whether or not they're primary and secondary, and going from there. But when all else fails, choose Smilodon or Dog, as those two tend to be the best overall. Now, before we move on to mounted combat and some of the basics there, let's talk about equipment. So I touched on this a little bit earlier with the barding, but in addition to barding, animal companions can equip a lot of equipment. Helmets, capes, belts. They don't get access to the full range of equipment that your companions will normally be able to use, but animal companions can equip a lot of equipment, which can give them some serious bonuses. And you combine that with their already kind of high innate bonuses to their stats, and you can push some animal companion stats into some really high territory and make them very useful. But in general, you can make them very effective at what they do as long as you're equipping them with appropriate items. Especially since Wrath of the Righteous actually does have items specifically made for animal companions that will give them more damage when they use natural attacks. And of course, remember, anything that affects natural attacks is going to affect your animal companion's natural attacks. Now from here, let's move on to mounted combat. So we're going to go over the basics here, but probably most importantly are size requirements. Because in order to use an animal companion as a mount, you have to meet the size requirements. Basically, your animal companion needs to be your animal companion and also one size larger than your character, meaning that a lot of animal companions can't necessarily be used as a mount right out of the gate because most of them don't go from medium to large size until level 7, and your character will start out at medium size, with the exception of the halfling. They will start out at small size and can use medium-sized mounts as a mount immediately. Another exception to this is the horse. Horses are always available to use as a mount right out of the gate, but an easy way to figure out whether or not you can use your mount is whether or not you have the ability to mount it. So once you meet the size requirements, you'll be given an ability called Saddle Up, which will allow you to actually mount. Now, outside of combat, you can do this freely, but if you're in combat, this is a move action. And from here, let's talk about a few things that are just good to know. So for starters, when you are in mounted combat, you and your mount are going to go at the same time, which is kind of by necessity, really. But your movement is going to be dictated by your mount. So whatever your mount speed is now your movement speed, which is almost always going to be more than the base 30. Now, when it comes to mounted combat, the sort of mainstay, if you will, is the charge attack. Everybody gets a charge, you just have to pull up the ability menu and grab it to use it. But in mounted combat, both you and the mount get the bonus from charging. And when you combine that with an animal companion that has pounce, like for instance the Smilodon, you can do some serious damage with a charge, especially with the Cavalier class, which is kind of built around mounted combat charging, at least in some cases. Though, to be clear, charging requires you to have a straight path to the target. And when you're in mounted combat, I would suggest trying to move in straight lines as much as possible, as the game can bug out a little bit and kind of cause you to lose your movement if you trip up on the terrain at all. So try to move in straight lines as much as you possibly can. Another really big bonus to mounted combat in general is that if you and the mount both have teamwork feats, you get them by default because you are inherently adjacent to each other. This is why teamwork feats are are fantastic for animal companions and can be very, very useful on top of a mount because, again, you're just inherently adjacent to it. For those who are unaware, teamwork feats are various feats that work as long as both characters next to each other have the same feat. This can give you more damage, more bonuses to attack, and being in mounted combat makes this very easy. Another thing to keep in mind in mounted combat is that most of the time your mount is the target of enemy attacks, meaning that its AC is going to be the one checked and its hit points will be the ones taking the damage. However, if you are hit with an AoE spell like a fireball, a bomb, etc., that's going to affect you both because you're both in range. But generally speaking, when you're in mounted combat, they're attacking your mount first. If you fall off of your mount because your mount dies or goes down, you're going to fall prone, which is going to make you very easy to kill as well because you're going to have to spend your next turn standing up, which gives every enemy around you an attack of opportunity. And because of this, your mount survivability in mounted combat is pretty important. This is why sometimes people prefer to maximize survivability rather than damage in those cases, which is relatively easy with equipment, bonuses, remember to buff your pets as well, and they should have a ton of AC just naturally, so it's not as hard as it sounds. Another thing to think about in combat is that most reach weapons in mounted combat can be a little bit of a pain, because unless you're charging directly to an enemy, if you're just attacking enemies normally by running up to them, you're only going to get in range of your reach weapon, which means your animal companion won't be in range to make its attacks and can actually wind up doing less damage. So if you're using a reach weapon, remember to get right up on the enemy so your animal companion can attack too. So some other things to keep in mind about mounted combat are the mounted combat feats, which start with a feat just called mounted combat. This allows you, the rider, to potentially negate 1 hit per round to your mount, and also it unlocks all of the other mounted combat feats, but it requires high mobility skill to actually get the most out of, because it's going to check your mobility skill and potentially negate a hit to your mount if you pass the check. And then we get things like Spirited Charge. Spirited Charge is probably the single most useful feat if you're going for mounted combat, because this doubles the damage on your charge, and it actually doubles everything involved. So it is very strong, and if you're going to do mounted combat, you should absolutely be using Spirited Charge. Then we have Indomitable Mount. This allows you, again, to use a mobility check to allow you to make up for a failed saving throw on your mount's behalf instead of just negating a hit, which overall can be incredibly useful. But those are honestly the main things to know when it comes to mounted combat, because truth be told, it's not really that big of a deal and can make you stronger most of the time. But the last thing I want to mention on mounted combat before we move on is if you really want to get the most out of mounted combat, you're going to want to play a Cavalier. They get a ton of bonuses to specifically mounted combat and can be a really fun way to play the game for a lot of people. Again, honestly, a lot simpler than people seem to think. All of that said though, guys, there is an updated video about animal companions and a little bit about mounted combat, so I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.